The morning started quietly in the small town. The streets were calm with only a few cars passing by. An old lady lived in a modest house at the edge of the town. She lived alone since her children had grown and moved to different cities. She had always loved the peace of her home and the quiet life she led, tending to her small garden and enjoying her daily routines. But that morning something felt different. A cold wind was blowing, sharper than usual. Clouds hung low and heavy in the sky, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. By late morning, the snowfall had grown heavier. The small town that usually seemed so lively now looked like a winter wonderland, with everything covered in a thick blanket of white. Trees sagged under the weight of the snow, and the roads, usually clear, were quickly disappearing under the powdery layers. The lady watched from her window as the storm grew stronger, the wind howling and shaking the doors. She felt a sense of worry. Snowstorms were not unusual in winter, but this one seemed stronger, more persistent, and the thought of being isolated alone in her house made her uneasy. She was preparing her morning tea when she heard an unexpected knock on the door. The sound startled her because it was unusual for anyone to come by this early in the winter, especially in such harsh weather. She wiped her hands on her apron and carefully opened the door. Outside stood a group of men wearing leather jackets, helmets in hand, and boots covered in snow. At first she froze. She had heard stories about motorcycle gangs. Her mind raced with caution, but as she looked closer, she noticed something else. These men looked tired, cold and wet from the snowstorm. One of them, the tallest of the group, spoke in a calm voice. "Excuse us, ma'am. We're stranded here because of the snow. Is there any chance we could warm up inside for a while?" The old lady hesitated for a moment. Her mind was telling her to be careful. She had always been cautious around strangers. But then she looked at their faces again. They were shivering, their teeth chattering, and some of them were rubbing their hands together to stay warm. She felt a surge of compassion. After all, these were human beings just like anyone else caught in a storm beyond their control. "All right," she said gently, stepping aside. "Come in quickly. You're freezing." They thanked her and entered one by one. The warm air from the heater brushed against their cold skin, and they visibly relaxed. The lady noticed how heavy their leather jackets were with snow, and how exhausted they looked from riding in such terrible weather. She guided them to the living room, where she had set a small fire in the fireplace. The room was cozy, with simple furniture, a few photographs on the walls, and a small bookshelf filled with well-worn books. While they settled in, she prepared tea and hot sandwiches. The smell of warm bread and tea filled the room, and she handed out blankets for those still shivering. One of the bikers, a younger man with a nervous smile, said, "We really didn't expect anyone to help us in a place like this." "Thank you." The old lady smiled softly, stirring her tea. "Everyone needs help sometimes. Today it happens to be you." As they drank and ate, the conversation slowly began. At first it was quiet, with only small talk about the storm and the roads. But gradually they began sharing stories of their travels, the long rides they loved, and even the challenges they faced as a group. The lady listened quietly, intrigued by the different perspectives of life on the road. She realized that despite their rough appearance, there was a warmth to them that most people never noticed. They laughed softly at each other's jokes, and their eyes showed relief at being somewhere safe and warm. Outside, the storm continued without mercy. Snow piled higher on the ground, making it impossible for the bikers to continue their journey. They looked out the window, worried about being stuck far from home. But the old lady reassured them. "You don't need to worry about that tonight. Stay here, rest and warm up. You're safe." They thanked her again, and she noticed a subtle change in their demeanor. The tough exterior, the hardened faces they showed to the world, softened in the safety of her home. One of the older bikers, who had been quiet until now, said, "You know, it's rare to find someone as kind as you. People see us and expect the worst, but you don't judge." She shook her head. "I don't believe in judging anyone before knowing them. Life is too short for assumptions." The bikers nodded, understanding her words more deeply than she could imagine. They talked into the afternoon, sharing small personal stories, memories of the roads they had traveled, and even stories about their families. The old lady shared some of her own life experiences too, but carefully without making the conversation heavy. She wanted the atmosphere to remain light and comforting, not burdened by worries or fears. As evening approached, the snow outside showed no sign of stopping. The storm had turned into a full-blown blizzard, and the roads were now completely covered. The bikers realized that leaving was impossible until the next day. She offered her spare beds, which they gratefully accepted, and helped them settle in. She even laid out extra blankets on the floor for those who didn't want to sleep in the beds. Despite the initial tension, the house became warm and lively. The crackling fireplace, the scent of tea and bread, and the sound of laughter filled the rooms. The old lady watched them, amazed at how quickly strangers could feel like guests and even more like friends. She realized that kindness didn't just help others, it changed her too. She felt a sense of joy in giving, a happiness that had been missing for a while. Later that night, as she prepared her own simple dinner, she glanced around at the group, now resting quietly. Some were reading, some were talking softly, and a few had even fallen asleep in the living room. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside there was warmth, comfort, and a sense of safety that neither the weather nor the distance could affect. Before going to her own bed, she made sure everyone was comfortable, refilled the water glasses, and tucked extra blankets around those who needed them. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing she had made a difference for these strangers. She didn't see them as bikers with a fearsome reputation anymore. She saw them as human beings caught in a storm seeking only warmth and safety. As she finally lay down to sleep, she thought about the unpredictability of life. How a normal morning, starting quietly as any other, had turned into an extraordinary day full of unexpected events and new connections. She realized that sometimes, kindness is not a choice, it's a necessity, a bridge between people, and a way to bring light even in the coldest, darkest moments. The snow continued to fall outside, thick and unrelenting, but inside her home there was calm. The old lady drifted into sleep, confident that she had done the right thing. Tomorrow, the bikers would leave and life would return to its usual rhythm. But she knew that this day, this storm, and the warmth she had shared would leave a lasting mark, not just on them, but on herself too. Little did she know the act of kindness she offered that day would not end with the storm. It would ripple far beyond her home, reaching places and people she had never imagined, and the story of this quiet, snowy day would grow into something much larger than a simple shelter from a storm. The night settled over the small town like a quiet blanket, but outside the snowstorm was still relentless. The wind howled against the windows and the snow piled higher, covering the roads and making the town feel isolated from the rest of the world. Inside, the old lady's home was warm and welcoming. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting a golden glow across the living room. The bikers, tired from hours of riding in the storm, were beginning to relax. Their leather jackets hung damp and heavy, and the cold had left their faces pink and their hands stiff. The old lady moved from one person to another, making sure everyone had a cup of hot tea and a snack to warm them from the inside. She had a small kitchen, but she worked quickly, slicing bread, frying eggs, and preparing a simple stew she had simmering on the stove. The smell of cooking filled the house, bringing comfort and a sense of home. The bikers watched her, surprised at the ease and care with which she moved. Her movements calm and confident despite the chaos outside. One of the bikers, the youngest in the group, spoke softly. "You really didn't have to do this for us. We could have managed." The lady smiled gently. "You needed help, and I happened to have a warm house and some food. That's enough reason for me." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. For a moment, the young biker seemed lost in thought, realizing that her kindness was genuine, not forced. The others nodded in agreement, sipping their tea quietly. For them, life on the road was usually harsh and unforgiving. They were used to tough nights, rain, snow, and freezing winds, but here, in this little house, they were safe. As the evening progressed, conversation started to flow more naturally. At first, it was small talk, questions about the town, about the storm, about how she lived alone. But soon stories began to emerge. One of the bikers, an older man with graying hair, shared a story from his childhood about learning to ride motorcycles with his older brother. Another spoke about his favorite road trips and the places he had visited. There was laughter, gentle teasing, and even some quiet reflection as they talked about the challenges they had faced in life. The old lady listened attentively, asking questions here and there, showing genuine interest. She didn't judge or interrupt. She simply provided a space where these men could relax, be themselves, and speak honestly. It was clear to her that they were more than their rough exteriors. Each had a story, a past, a set of dreams and regrets. just like anyone else. At one point, the youngest biker looked around the room, hesitating, and then said, "I never thought someone like you would let people like us into their home. Most people would. Well, they'd be scared." The old lady shook her head. "Fear is easy. Kindness is harder, but worth it. You are human just like me. That's enough reason to care." Her words seemed to touch everyone. Even the toughest-looking bikers relaxed further, letting the weight of the storm and the road melt away in the warmth of her house. One of the older bikers nodded slowly. "You're right. You're right. Not many people see that in us." The night went on, and the storm outside showed no sign of letting up. The bikers decided to make themselves comfortable. Some took blankets to the living room floor, curling up in corners, while others claimed the spare bedrooms. The old lady helped them settle in, fluffing pillows and tucking blankets around shoulders, showing the care of someone used to looking after others. As they rested, small gestures of friendship began to appear. One of the bikers brought a small, worn photograph from his wallet and shared a story about his family. The lady listened quietly, nodding and offering gentle encouragement. Another bike softly hummed an old tune, and soon a few others joined in. The music was low and gentle, adding a peaceful rhythm to the house as the storm raged outside. For the old lady, it was remarkable how quickly strangers could become like family. She thought about her own life, about the quiet years she had spent alone, and realized that moments like these were precious. The warmth she felt from helping someone, from being needed, was more powerful than any material comfort she could provide. She had given them shelter, yes, but in return, they had given her laughter, stories, and the reminder that connection could come in the most unexpected ways. At one point, the older biker who had shared the story of his childhood quietly said, "You know, it's strange. We spend our lives on the road, chasing freedom, speed, and adventure. But tonight, being here, this is the kind of freedom that matters. Feeling safe, cared for, even if just for a few hours." The lady nodded, understanding the sentiment. Freedom is not just about being able to go anywhere. It's about being able to rest without fear, to feel warmth and kindness. That's a kind of freedom most people overlook. As the evening turned to night, the storm outside intensified. The wind whipped against the windows and snow piled high against the doors. But inside, the house was filled with light, warmth, and quiet conversation. The bikers began to share small jokes, teasing each other about who would sleep on the coldest floor or who hogged the blankets. There was laughter, a few playful arguments, and a sense of camaraderie that had formed in just a few hours. The old lady watched it all with a smile. She realized that kindness was contagious. By opening her home and her heart, she had created a space where strangers could become human again, shedding the fearsome image they carried outside and showing the people they truly were. The laughter, the stories, the simple warmth of tea and blankets, these were small things, but they mattered. They mattered a lot. Later, as everyone began to settle down for the night, the old lady moved quietly around the house, making sure everyone was comfortable. She placed a few extra blankets near the fire for anyone who might get cold, refilled water glasses, and quietly checked that the doors were secure against the storm. Then finally, she went to her own bed, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Even as she drifted off to sleep, she thought about the day, the storm, and the unexpected visitors who had come into her life. She realized that sometimes life gives you challenges not to scare you, but to show you the power of compassion and connection. By helping these strangers, she had found a kind of fulfillment she didn't know she was missing. The bikers, too, slept peacefully, their tough exteriors softened by warmth, kindness, and the safety of the old lady's home. For the first time in a long while, they could rest without worry, knowing that there were people in the world who cared, who would open their doors without judgment, simply to help another human being. The night passed slowly but peacefully. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small home there was calm. In the quiet hours before dawn, the old lady thought about the lessons she had learned from the strangers she had welcomed. She thought about bravery, about trust, about the ways kindness could change lives, and she felt grateful, not for the visitors themselves, but for the reminder that small acts of love and compassion could ripple far beyond what anyone could see. When the first light of morning began to creep through the windows, the snow had stopped. The storm had passed, leaving the town transformed into a sparkling white landscape. The bikers began to stir, stretching and preparing to leave, but the memories of the night lingered. They had been strangers seeking shelter, but they were leaving with a deeper understanding of what kindness could mean. The old lady watched them quietly, feeling a mixture of pride and humility. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, only offered what she could: warmth, food, and a safe place to rest. Yet the impact of those simple actions was clear. She had reminded them that even in a world that often judged too quickly, there were still people willing to care, willing to open their homes and hearts. As the bikers prepared to leave, they thanked her repeatedly, their voices filled with genuine gratitude. One of them, the youngest, said quietly, "We'll never forget this night. Not just the help, but the way you made us feel. Like people, not like a stereotype." The old lady smiled, waving them off. "Take care of yourselves. Remember, kindness is always worth it." With that, the bikers mounted their motorcycles and rode off, leaving tracks in the freshly fallen snow. The old lady watched them disappear down the quiet road, her heart full, knowing that this night, this storm, and this unexpected encounter would stay with her and with them forever. Little did she know, her kindness would ripple far beyond this small moment. The impact of opening her door and offering warmth was only beginning to unfold, and the story of this night would grow in ways she could never have imagined. Morning came slowly to the small town, and the world outside had transformed completely. Overnight, the storm had passed, leaving the town blanketed in thick, sparkling snow. Every roof, tree, and fence post was covered in white, and the sunlight made it glimmer like crystals. The roads were still difficult to travel, but the storm's rage had softened into a peaceful winter silence. The old lady looked out of her window, taking in the quiet beauty. She felt a sense of relief. The storm was over, and the night of unexpected guests had passed without incident. The bikers, still inside her home, were waking up slowly. Some stretched their stiff limbs, groaning quietly as they rose from the living room floor. Others rubbed their eyes as they prepared to leave. The night had been long, but it had also been a time of warmth, safety, and human connection. The old lady moved quietly through the house, preparing a simple breakfast of toast, eggs, and hot tea. She had made extra, knowing that her unexpected guests would need nourishment before they continued their journey. As they ate, conversation flowed naturally. There were laughs over small mistakes in cooking, friendly debates over which biker had slept the most comfortably, and gentle teasing about who had snored the loudest during the night. The tension from the storm had melted entirely, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and shared experience. The old lady watched them with a gentle smile, realizing that these men, often feared by society, were capable of the same warmth and humor as anyone else. After breakfast, the bikers began to prepare their motorcycles. The snow outside was still thick, but the storm had cleared enough to allow careful travel. As they loaded their gear, they kept looking back at the old lady's house, a small sense of hesitation in their movements. They didn't want to leave so quickly. The safety and comfort they had found here were rare in their lives. One of them, the older biker with graying hair, paused and said softly, "You really opened your home to us without knowing anything about us. That's not something we see every day." The lady simply smiled. "Everyone needs a little help sometimes. Today it happened to be you, that's all." Their eyes met hers, filled with a mix of gratitude and admiration. It was clear that her simple act of kindness had made an impression, deeper than she could have guessed. In the past, they had probably been judged for their appearance, their lifestyle, or the reputation of their group. Here they were seen for who they truly were. Human beings in need of warmth and safety, and they felt a strange but comforting sense of acceptance. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, the sound of engines starting up filled the snowy morning air. The old lady waved them off, her hand trembling slightly. Not out of fear, but from the strange emotion of seeing strangers she had cared for leave her home. She knew this would be a story she would remember forever, but she didn't expect it to go beyond the walls of her house. She had acted out of simple human decency, not thinking it would become anything more. But the story of her kindness did not stay inside her home for long. Neighbors who had seen the bikers arrive during the storm began talking, their curiosity turning into admiration. "Did you see her? She invited those bikers in during that storm," one neighbor exclaimed to another. Soon the tale spread through the town like wildfire. People who had been skeptical of both the bikers and the storm's dangers began to see things differently. Here was an elderly woman, known for her quiet and reserved nature, showing courage and warmth in a way that inspired others. By midday, word had reached even local businesses. Shopkeepers, postal workers, and other residents shared the story over counters and coffee cups, each retelling slightly more animated than the last. The small town had always been close-knit, and tales of human kindness traveled quickly. People were amazed that the Hells Angels, feared by many for their reputation, had been welcomed into someone's home without incident. It challenged assumptions and created a ripple effect, making people reconsider their judgments about both the bikers and the old lady. The lady herself remained humble. She didn't see her actions as extraordinary. For her, it was simply the right thing to do. She returned to her daily routines, tending her garden, organizing her home, and preparing meals as usual. But she couldn't help feeling a quiet joy every time someone mentioned the storm and the bikers. It reminded her that even in a small life, ordinary actions could have extraordinary effects. Meanwhile, the bikers rode through the snowy roads, their engines roaring gently in the quiet morning. They talked among themselves about the night spent in the warm house, reflecting on how rare it was to encounter genuine kindness. One of them, usually quiet and reserved, said aloud, "I never thought someone like her would care. She didn't just give us shelter, she made us feel human." The others nodded in agreement. They had spent years on the road, experiencing freedom, adventure, and danger. But here was a lesson they would not forget. Courage and kindness could be found in the most unexpected places. For them, the storm had been an inconvenience, a challenge, but it had also been a catalyst for an experience that touched their lives profoundly. Back in the town, the buzz continued. People who had seen the bikers' arrival during the storm were eager to see if the story would continue. Some children, inspired by the tale, watched the roads in the hope of seeing the bikers return, imagining what it would be like to witness such a unique encounter. Local newspapers even picked up the story, highlighting the contrast between fear and kindness, reputation and reality. The old lady, however, was indifferent to the attention. She had acted from the heart, and that was enough for her. Recognition, she felt, was unnecessary. Throughout the day, she received visits from neighbors and friends who wanted to hear the story from her perspective. They came with curiosity and admiration, bringing small gifts like baked goods or handmade scarves as tokens of respect. She accepted them graciously, smiling quietly but always emphasizing that it was nothing special. "I did what anyone would do," she told them. These men were in need. That's all. Despite her modesty, the story continued to grow. Local children, fascinated by the idea of Hells Angels in their town, shared tales of the night with classmates and friends. Adults, inspired by her bravery, spoke about how kindness could change lives in ways that force or strength never could. The small town, usually quiet and routine-bound, was now buzzing with a renewed sense of connection and humanity. Meanwhile, the bikers continued their journey, but the memory of the old lady's home stayed with them. It was not just a place of warmth and food. It was a symbol of something more significant: trust, acceptance, and the ability to see beyond appearances. For a group often judged harshly by society, this simple act of hospitality reminded them that the world still held people willing to care without conditions. By evening, the old lady sat by her window once again, looking out at the snowy streets. She reflected on the day, feeling a sense of fulfillment and quiet pride. The storm had tested both her courage and compassion, and she had passed in a way that felt right to her. She thought about the bikers, hoping they were safe on the roads, and felt a strange connection to them even from a distance. As the sun set, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, the old lady prepared a simple dinner. She hummed softly to herself, thinking about how a single act of kindness could ripple outward, affecting people in ways she couldn't fully see. She didn't know it yet, but this night, this story would come back to her in ways more extraordinary than she could imagine. The bikers, moved by her generosity, would return in a show of gratitude that no one in the town would soon forget. That evening, she closed her curtains against the cold and sat by the fire with a cup of tea. The snow outside sparkled under the fading light, and for the first time in a long while she felt completely content. Her home had been a sanctuary, not just for herself but for strangers who needed it. She realized that life's small gestures, warmth, food, safety, and a listening ear, were sometimes the most profound acts of courage and humanity. The night was calm and peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm. And while the old lady didn't know it, her simple act of kindness had already begun to leave a mark far beyond her home. The story of the snowstorm, the bikers, and the quiet courage of a woman living alone would soon ripple through the town, touching hearts and changing perceptions forever. The morning air was crisp and clear, the snow sparkling under the early sun like tiny diamonds. The small town was quiet, with only the occasional car passing slowly along snow-lined streets. The old lady had begun her usual morning routine, tending to her small garden that was now blanketed in white and preparing tea for herself. She had no idea that today would be unlike any other. It started as a distant sound, low and rhythmic, that gradually grew louder. At first she thought it might be a snowplow or a truck making its way through the town, but the sound became unmistakable. The roar of motorcycles. Curious, she stepped out onto her porch, pulling her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes widened as she saw a long line of motorcycles approaching, stretching down the road, their engines rumbling in unison. Her heart skipped a beat. She recognized some of the motorcycles from the night of the storm, but there were far more than before. What she had expected was a few bikers, perhaps coming back to say a simple thank you. Instead, it was an impressive convoy of over 100 bikes, each rider wearing leather jackets and helmets, riding slowly and carefully toward her home. The old lady stood frozen on her porch, a mix of surprise and disbelief washing over her. Could all these people really have come because of her? She had only opened her door to 15 stranded bikers during the storm, not expecting anything in return. Yet, here they were, hundreds of them, showing up in a display of gratitude she could never have imagined. One of the bikers at the front of the line raised his hand in a wave, signaling to her. Then another and another. The sound of engines was loud, but it was not intimidating. Instead, it carried a sense of respect, a deep acknowledgement of the kindness she had shown the night before. Slowly, the convoy came to a stop in front of her house, and the bikers began to remove their helmets. The old lady could feel her heart swelling. She had spent her life quietly, helping neighbors, tending to her home, and living simply. She had never expected such a grand gesture, and yet, the bikers were here not for themselves, but for her. They had returned not because they were stranded, not because they needed help, but because they wanted to honor her. The first group approached her door. They removed their boots, shaking off snow, and stepped inside with smiles and nods. "We wanted to come back and thank you properly," one of them said. "Last night you gave us warmth, safety, and care. Not everyone would do that. We can't forget it." The old lady, overwhelmed, could only smile softly. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I just did what anyone would do. You needed help, and I could offer it. That's all." But the bikers shook their heads. "It's more than that," another said. "You saw us for who we really are, not what people say we are. That's rare. That's why we're here." One by one, the bikers entered her home, removing jackets and offering thanks again. They were careful not to crowd her space, showing consideration for her home and her life. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace welcomed them, and the smell of tea and freshly baked bread seemed to make the moment even more intimate. The old lady moved among them, offering cups of tea and small snacks she had prepared, but her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer emotion of seeing so many people return just to honor her. Outside, the remaining bikers stayed with their motorcycles, some helping to clear snow to make room, others simply standing and chatting quietly, watching the scene unfold. The town, noticing the unusual sight, began to gather. Neighbors peered from windows, some stepping outside, curious about the crowd and the convoy of motorcycles that had arrived. Children's eyes widened in wonder, and adults whispered in disbelief. Stories about the old lady's kindness had spread quickly, but seeing such a display of gratitude in person left everyone amazed. Inside, the bikers shared stories of how the previous night had changed their perspectives. They spoke softly about the rare moments when strangers treated them with genuine warmth, about how unusual it was to feel seen and cared for instead of judged. The old lady listened quietly, her hands folded, absorbing each word. She had not realized that her simple act of hospitality had such a deep impact. One of the older bikers, whose face carried years of travel and hardship, spoke up. "You may think this is small, but to us it's huge. In our lives, people see the outside, the leather, the motorcycles, the reputation. But you saw the inside. You saw people who needed a little help. That's something we won't forget." Tears welled up in the old lady's eyes. She had never thought of herself as brave or special. She had simply acted out of empathy, opening her home and heart when she could. And now here were hundreds of people, showing her that such small gestures could have monumental effects. The bikers wanted to do something to honor her, something meaningful. They brought small gifts, handmade leather bracelets, keychains, and items they had crafted during their travels. They presented them with quiet humility, careful not to overwhelm her, yet with clear pride in showing gratitude. It was not the material value that mattered, but the thought and effort behind each gift. The old lady accepted each one with a soft smile, touched by the sincerity. She had never received such attention in her life, and yet she felt no arrogance, no discomfort. The moment was genuine, simple, and beautiful. It was a connection between human beings, bridging worlds that normally would not meet. The quiet, ordinary life of an elderly woman and the bold, adventurous life of motorcycle riders. As the morning turned into afternoon, more neighbors and townspeople arrived, drawn by curiosity and admiration. They watched the interaction, noting how the bikers treated the old lady with respect and care. It was clear that something extraordinary was happening. This was not a parade, not a spectacle. It was a heartfelt demonstration of gratitude and human connection. The bikers stayed for hours, talking, laughing, and sharing stories. They recounted the previous night, the storm, the warmth of her home, and how it had changed them. The old lady responded with quiet wisdom, emphasizing kindness, trust, and empathy. Every word she spoke seemed to leave an impression, not only on the bikers, but on the townspeople who had gathered to witness the scene. One of the younger bikers, who had been quiet for most of the morning, finally spoke up. "I never thought I'd meet someone like you," he said. "Someone who doesn't judge, who doesn't ask for anything, who just gives." "It's rare," the old lady smiled softly. "Kindness is always worth it. You never know whose life you might touch, or how a simple act can grow into something bigger than yourself." The bikers nodded, understanding more than words could express. They had come to thank her for her help during a snowstorm, but they were leaving with something far more valuable, a lesson in humanity, in seeing beyond appearances and in the power of compassion. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the bikers finally prepared to leave. This time there was no urgency, no concern about the storm. They were leaving because it was time, but their hearts were full. They mounted their motorcycles, revved the engines, and formed a line that stretched down the road. The old lady stood on her porch, waving, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, tears sparkling in her eyes. One by one, the bikers waved back, their engines rumbling in a respectful salute. The convoy slowly rolled down the snowy road, leaving behind tracks that would soon disappear in the afternoon snow, but leaving behind a memory that would last a lifetime. The townspeople watched quietly, feeling inspired and moved by the sight. After the bikers disappeared down the road, the old lady returned to her home. She sat by the fireplace holding a cup of tea, reflecting on the day. She realized that her small act of kindness had not only changed the bikers' lives, but had also inspired her community. People saw that courage and humanity did not always come in grand gestures or loud announcements. Sometimes it was as simple as opening your door to a stranger and offering warmth, safety, and respect. The gifts from the bikers sat on her table, each one a reminder of the unexpected, extraordinary day. She touched each item gently, remembering the faces and words of the people who had arrived in her home during the storm, and then returned in such large numbers to show their gratitude. She felt a quiet sense of fulfillment and joy, knowing that her actions had created ripples far beyond what she could have imagined. That night, she went to bed with a heart full of peace and satisfaction. The storm was gone, the snow quieted, and the town had witnessed something rare and beautiful. The story of the old lady and the bikers would be told again and again, not just for the drama of motorcycles and snow, but for the humanity, respect, and kindness that had brought everyone together. The old lady slept that night knowing that simple kindness could be stronger than fear, more powerful than reputation, and capable of creating connections that last a lifetime. The bikers, too, carried her lesson with them as they rode into the distance. That generosity and compassion could touch lives in ways that no one could predict. The days after the bikers' return were quiet, but different. The small town seemed to carry a sense of warmth that had not been there before, as if the kindness of one person had left a mark on everyone who heard the story. People talked about the old lady, not just as someone who lived alone, but as someone who had opened her home and heart without hesitation, showing that courage and generosity could exist even in the simplest of actions. The old lady went about her daily routines, tending her small garden, preparing meals, and keeping her house neat. But she noticed subtle changes around her. Neighbors smiled more warmly when they passed by. Strangers waved from the street. Children, curious and inspired, would stop by occasionally, asking questions about the night of the storm, eager to hear the story again. Each time she recounted it, she felt a small spark of joy. It was a reminder that one act of kindness could inspire many others, rippling through lives in ways she had never imagined. Local newspapers and online articles had picked up the story, spreading it beyond the town. People from nearby communities called or wrote letters, expressing admiration for her bravery and generosity. She received small gifts in the mail, thank you notes, handmade crafts, and even simple baked goods from people she had never met. Each item reminded her that actions driven by the heart rarely go unnoticed, and even small gestures can create connections that reach far beyond their origin. The memory of the biker's return remained vivid in her mind. She often thought about the 100 motorcycles lined up outside her home, the engines rumbling like a chorus of gratitude. She remembered the way each biker had looked at her with genuine respect and admiration, and how the room had felt filled with warmth and appreciation. That day, she realized, was not about fear, stereotypes, or appearances. It was about trust, understanding, and the simple truth that people, at their core, are human. As winter slowly began to fade and the snow melted into clear roads, the bikers kept in touch. A few sent postcards, others dropped by when traveling nearby, and some even invited her to visit them in their cities. Every visit was met with laughter, stories, and shared meals. They treated her as part of their extended family, a symbol of the kindness they carried with them wherever they went. She had never expected this, and yet it felt natural. Bonds had formed during a storm, but those bonds endured through time, distance, and circumstance. The town itself seemed to change as well. People began to show more patience, more empathy, and more willingness to help each other. Stories of the old lady's courage inspired small acts of kindness, neighbors helping neighbors shovel snow, offering rides, or simply lending a listening ear. Children learned that bravery was not always about grand gestures or heroic adventures. Sometimes it was about opening your door, offering warmth, and treating strangers with respect and compassion. The old lady reflected often on the events of that week. She thought about the storm, the bikers, and how a simple decision to welcome strangers into her home had created a chain reaction. She realized that life has a way of presenting unexpected opportunities, moments when one act of courage or generosity can touch many lives. She had been given a chance to do good, and she took it without hesitation. The rewards, she knew, were not material. They were the laughter, the stories, the trust, and the lasting human connections she had helped create. One evening, as she sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea, she thought about the lessons she had learned. She realized that kindness is a form of strength. It requires courage to act when the world tells you to be cautious, to judge, or to ignore someone in need. But the rewards, human connection, gratitude, and the knowledge that you have made a positive difference are priceless. She had experienced this firsthand, and now she carried it as a quiet wisdom, ready to be shared with anyone who might need it. The biker's influence on her life was not just emotional. It brought practical changes as well. She found herself more confident and